So I'm here today to talk with Minister Brian Gledhill, and Brian is the president of the Spiritualist Lyceum Union. And the Lyceum Union has got a rich history, and that's what we're here to talk about today. And we're going to focus on its beginnings and some of the key people in the Lyceum. So Brian, could you tell us something about the beginnings of the Lyceum and who were the people who were part of its formation?
Yes, Al. And first of all, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are in the world. The Lyceum is something that's really and truly international. Its roots lie in America at the behest of a man who had a dream, an uneducated man. He was a farm worker. He dreamed, basically, that he'd spoken to his mother. And his mother had come to him and told him everything would be all right. And he couldn't understand it because his mother was at home. When he got there, he found that his mother wasn't at home. His mother had passed on. And what he'd seen was this apparition, this lady that he took to be his mother, had appeared at the time that his mother had died. Subsequently, he had a dream that the children living in America at that time, being poor, being uneducated, he dreamt that they were happy, that they were marching together, they were all wearing different coloured robes, and they were learning. And he put that dream into practice. He held meetings, he founded a movement which he called the Children's Progressive Lyceum in America. And lots of people began to join him and share with him in that dream. I suppose you could say he's the first man to say, I had a dream. And in that sense, the dream really came true and took off. It's still very, very viable in America. There is still a Children's Progressive Lyceum Union in America. But that basically is where the Lyceum comes from. It comes from a need to educate, a need to make children happy and people happy, to teach them about the basics of this spiritual life that we're all looking towards. And it came across to England, not by accident, but by Mrs. Hayden, who came across. Maria Hayden brought the truth across with her of spiritualism and the Lyceum. And it took root in England, first of all in Nottingham, where a family and their friends started to meet together in the spiritual fashion. And it grew from there. And from tiny acorns, mighty oak trees grow. So thank you, Andrew Jackson Davis, for the Lyceum.
Absolutely. And what a great story of how the Lyceum began to grow and move over to the UK. And so once it did get here, Brian, can you tell us who were the people who were involved in the formation of a movement over here?
Yeah, it's a bit like today. In the early days, spiritualists were called the table rappers, because that's what they practiced, table tilting or communication by using a table. A laborious, long-winded process to get a message. And it's rather strange. One of the simpler messages that was spelled out in my presence at Stansted Hall quite a few years ago now, we were sitting with Vi Kipling and Nora Shaw, and the table spelt out messages to indicate that the communicator was someone called Eddie. And then it spelt out Nora in here, Norainhere, which is the laborious part of the message. And Nora Shaw said, yes, I'm here. And the table said, no, Norainhere. Remember, there is no punctuation. And Nora got quite frustrated, as she does, and said, yes, I am here. and it very slowly spelt out, no rain here. Because the last time Nora and Eddie had been out together, Eddie Moss, who was a minister just for a year, they went to Darlington Church in the rain. Neither of them had umbrellas. And getting from the car to the church, they got drenched. They did the service in wet clothes and made it back to the car. That was the message from Eddie. Quite evidential. There is no rain here. And that's a simple message. Can you imagine in the early days of spiritualism the kind of messages that were coming through from these table rappers? In England, the table rappers ended up in Ossett, which is another town, a little town in West Yorkshire, near to Wakefield, near to where Alfred Kitson was born, the gentleman that we are to talk about. And Alfred Kitson's grandma went to see them, the table rappers. She was thoroughly disgusted. She considered that they were controlled by imps who were children, and the children who was of the devil were bad, and the children that were of the Lord were good. Those from the devil came back to torment mankind. Those from the Lord didn't have to. That was their idea of the table rappers. And that's the beginning of British spiritualism, believe it or not. Alfred Kitson's father, who was in his own right a lay preacher for the Methodist Church. He was a member of the Primitive Methodist Church. And he went along to the table rappers and he took Alfred with him. His purpose was to debunk the table rappers. That was his idea. He said that it was all rubbish. He knew it was rubbish. He was going to prove that it was all wrong. And in that meeting, he was given evidence, he was given a message, and he decided to follow up the investigation. It took him 2 years. At the end of 2 years, he declared that the table rappers were genuine. It was all accurate. And he followed spiritualism from that day. That's one family. And this was happening all over England. There wasn't any organisation to spiritualism. It was all happening in localised pockets. In Ossett, Alfred Kitson by this time had grown up and he was interested in forming lyceums. And at first it wasn't very successful. It wasn't that easy. But he learned. He communicated with Andrew Jackson Davis, and the Lyceum holds some of the letters that went backwards and to from Kitson and Davis's replies. He also communicated with Emma Hardinge Britten because he'd heard of Emma, he'd heard of her involvement with the spiritual movement. And the letters from Emma are quite interesting if you can read them. The handwriting wasn't all that good. But this grouping of people led to a greater understanding of spiritualism. And from it, we got two branches. We got the spiritualist movement, which formed churches and became the religious side of what was happening. And we got the Lyceum. And these Lyceums that were springing up were educational. They were teaching people what spiritualism was about. It wasn't anything to do with children or adults. It was about anybody who wanted to come and learn. And not to develop. The last thing they wanted was to develop other people to be mediums. They wanted to develop people into beings who could understand what spiritualism was. And basically, that's the English side of the birth of spiritualism. Alfred Kitson, because of his involvement right at the beginning, became known as Dad. He was Dad Kitson. And all his life, he was Dad Kitson, from being a young man to being a very old man. And Dad Kitson was instrumental in forming the Lyceum movement in England. He was in at its beginning. He was in, not just with inception, but in conception, in effect. He made the concept of the Lyceum, and he helped to administer it through many years.
And so he was obviously really key to the formation of the Lyceum. Can you tell us something about how it developed? And of course, one of the things that we still have today from that time is the Lyceum manual, something that's still in print and something that many spiritualists, including myself, refer to quite a lot.
Yeah, the development of the Lyceum wasn't that quick, in effect. From its early days, it stayed relatively small for quite a number of years. It developed slowly, but like anything that develops slowly, it developed well. So that the people who went there were really keen, keen as mustard. It became, if you like, a haven. Bearing in mind that in that time, Alfred was born in 1855, and education was something that was hit miss, to say the best, very, very haphazard. Alfred himself went to school for about 6 weeks, in total, not all at the same time. He didn't learn a great deal. He went to Sunday school in the primitive Methodist church, where he learned to read. And it was a Sunday school. It wasn't anything to do with religion. It was a school on Sunday for the people who had to work. And like Alfred, children at that time were going to work at 9. Alfred was a hurrier, went down the mines at 9. Well, he went down the mines before he was 9, actually. He worked for his uncle as a hurrier, and the boss found out that he was under 9, and the word is he made him play. Now that's a Yorkshire expression, that he made him have time off. He laid him off in effect, because he wasn't 9. When he was 9, he allowed him to go back to work on the condition that he went to school for 2 afternoons a week. And that's where Alfred got his education, for 2 afternoons a week. But at 9, he was going down the mine, and his job was to fill the tubs of coal. His uncle was the miner, he dug the coal out. Alfred filled the tubs. He had to riddle, he had to use a sieve to get the dust away from the solid objects. The solids went into a tub, and eventually he had enough to put in a tub of the dust. That went up as well. He had to fill 14 tubs of coal and think 4 or 5 tubs of dust a day. And his pay for that was a shilling. That's 5 new pence. So for 5 new pence, he had to work perhaps 8 or 10 hours down the mine in very, very dangerous conditions, in damp and cold, lack of ventilation. Quite a few miners suffocated from this gas that was being released, fire damp they called it. It was methane, and it poisoned them. So life was difficult. The Lyceum was a glimmer of light. And because Alfred realized that what Andrew Jackson Davis had taken in America and had these kids marching up and down, we could do in England. We could get these kids healthy. We could help them to regain some strength. So calisthenics was born. Calisthenics is an old-fashioned word for movement and music and exercise. You swung your arms about and marched in time to the music. And you marched up and down and made patterns in the ground. And it got these kids to move about. They weren't used to moving about. They got them to walk about and move. And it helped them to learn. It also gave them some discipline. Believe it or not, you would think with the life that they were leading, there's plenty of discipline, but it gave them a communal discipline. And an example of that is when quite a few years after it started, they had a meeting, in Lancashire. And 2 Lyceums from Yorkshire attended. The others all gave backward at the last minute, but Sorby Bridge and I think Bradford went across to Lancashire. Yeah. How they got there, the Lord alone knows. That perhaps had to catch trams and trains and walk, and they did also, but they got there. When they got to the venue, it hadn't been prepared. The farmer who had taken the money for hiring his field out hadn't mowed the grass. It was quite long. The field was stony, and the platform that he'd built, you couldn't see above the height of the grass. So it wasn't very good. But Kitson and the other leaders that were there decided they would carry on regardless. And because Sorby Bridge had arrived first, they were asked to march first. Then Bradford followed them on. They did calisthenics in the field. Every time the children came across a brick or a boulder, they picked it up and took it to the edge of the field. By the time they finished, the grass was trodden down. The field was flat. There were no pebbles, boulders, stones, bricks, or anything in the field. They were all at the edges of the field. And the children had a marvellous day. And then came home to Bradford and Sorby Bridge. They sang, they praised the God that they'd been learning about, they praised the Lyceum, and they did lots and lots of things that helped them to understand what working together was about. And I think they proved the point admirably. The farmer was amazed when he came back and saw the field. What he couldn't do, the children have done, the children of the Lyceum. So it had quite an impact on people and on people's lives. In truth, I said earlier on, I have a family connection. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was a spiritualist. I didn't know. My mother was adopted, so I didn't really know that the lady I spoke to every day was my grandmother. But my grandma was not very well educated. She couldn't read very well. And she went every week with a gentleman from up the road who called for her, and they went off to church. And he brought her back as well. That gentleman was Alfred Kitson. And of course, it wasn't well known, or it wasn't famous, or something. But off she used to go to church. And the apocryphal story is that on one occasion, Alfred asked her to speak in the Lyceum. And she stood up and she recited St. Paul's epistle to the Corinthians, chapter 12, verbatim. She couldn't have read it because she couldn't read that much, but she quoted it word for word, and was quite well known for it. She passed away, sadly, many, many years after that, but without following up on her spiritualism. She couldn't. But she was a very spiritual person, and I think that she got a lot of that from the Lyceum. It is part and parcel of what she was. That's what the Lyceum did for people. That's what the Lyceum was about. And I've always been grateful for my involvement in it, even though it was late, a late involvement. I've always been involved somewhere with the spiritual kingdom, and the Lyceum just puts it all together. Yeah.
So it's great to hear how Kitson took his experiences of hardship in his own life and sought to help others so that they could get through those hardships and really improve their well-being.
Yeah.
And I think we can really look back through reading the Lyceum manual, can't we, and get a glimpse of what it must have been like, and lots of what he did has been poured into the words of that book. Can you tell us something about the manual, Brian?
Yeah, I find it fascinating. And one of the parallels that I draw is with Andrew Jackson Davis. and Kitson, is that both were uneducated. And that's an important thing to remember, that both of them wrote lots and lots of books and manuals and instructions, and lots and lots of things were put together in their name with their words and their intent. And you think, well, Andrew Jackson Davis was a farm boy. His father was a cobbler. So he had very, very poor outlooks and upbringings. Kitson was the son and the grandson of a miner, and he went down the mines himself. He didn't go to school. And yet he collaborated with two very well-known people to put together this manual. The idea of it was that the Lyceum had grown. The Lyceum movement had moved on a pace. And like I hear within the SNU now, the Spiritualist National Union, we don't have a book of our own. We can't use any book and say, this is ours. We have to use the Bible or the Torah or the Quran or whatever. And we have to say, well, this is taken from there and it's our idea, but we didn't have a book for the Lyceum. Andrew Jackson Davis decided that he would like to put together something for the children to have so that they could A, learn to read, B, learn, so that they could understand what spiritualism was really about. His collaborators, Emma Hardinge Britton, and the man called Harry Kersey, who lived in Newcastle. Well, Kersey was quite a wealthy man and a spiritualist. Emma was quite well known. She was a singer and an entertainer and a lecturer, because at that time she was lecturing all over the world for spiritualism. They understood his idea and they believed in him, for want of a better term. They believed in what he was talking about. So they offered to give their weight. In order to, if you like, get some kind of permission, if he needed it, he wrote to Andrew Jackson Davis, and Andrew Jackson Davis said, what a wonderful idea. What a smashing idea. It's marvelous. And he promptly sent $1, an American silver dollar. And that's still in the Lyceum archives. It was never spent, it was never cashed in. It's in the archives of the Lyceum movement. He gave his blessing, if you like, to what was to happen. And so they started to collect hymns, sayings, readings, and they started to categorize them. Thinking about the formation that they had, we've got Emma, who was a very busy lady, dashing here, there, and everywhere. She came up with one or two quite interesting things that are in the Lyceum manual. Kersey, who was a very spiritual person, quite wealthy, but still very busy. He was an industrialist. He had a lot of business. A lot of the work fell to Alfred. So Alfred had to put it together. And he decided he wouldn't write any more hymns. He got enough from what the others had written and where they were getting hymns from. But a lot of the hymns nobody could understand. They got the wrong idea. He said on one occasion, the hymn that Edward Lord Lytton wrote, Edward Bulwer Lytton wrote there is no death, the stars go down to rise upon a fairer shore, etc. He said it's a lovely hymn, but nobody really understands what it's about. You know, they all think it's about the stars and the sun, and it's not. So he wrote commentaries so that if anybody has been to a Salvation Army meeting, when the Salvation Army sing hymns, they sing one verse and the captain explains what the verse is about, puts a little bit of his own feelings in, then they sing the next verse. And Alfred did that with these hymns and readings and saying. So the idea was that the whole body of people that were there would recite the first verse. And then the conductor would explain what it meant. And Alfred wrote the explanation. And that continued throughout the hymns and the readings and the sayings. Of course, there were other readings that were written. Another one of my favourite characters is Edgar Allan Poe. And I know this might sound as though it's nothing to do with spiritualism, but Edgar Allan Poe wrote a poem called The Raven, which is a rather dark, sombre poem. And it's about a raven sitting on a bookshelf in a man's library, and the man's terrified of it because it signifies death. But Emma was asked to write something, and she wrote a piece, and it's based on Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. It's the same meter and everything. When the first time I read it, I was amazed because I know this, but I didn't know the words. And of course, it then made sense. Kersey did some more musical readings and he did some more explanation, and he actually wrote some hymns. So at the end of the day, they had a very, very interesting book. And the one I've got here is a modern version. And if I hold it up like that, that's a modern version of the Lyceum manual. It was printed before my time. It was printed very, very prolifically. We had thousands of them at one point. We've now had another reprint done, and it's reprinted in paperback, and it's a lot easier to read. Everybody tells me it's much better, the print's better. But one of the things that Kitson wrote or put together was a musical reading, and it's number 223 in the Lyceum manual, and it's called Stand Firm. And the hymn that it comes from is, "There are moments when life's shadows fall all darkly on the soul, hiding stars of hope behind them, when we walk with trembling footsteps, scarcely knowing how or where the dim paths we tread together are leading in our midnight of despair." And if you're like me, you read that and you think, what on earth is it about? So Kitson wrote, "As gold is tried and purified by the fierce fires of the refiner's furnace, so is man tried by troubles and difficulties," etc. That's what he did. He took something that was quite difficult to understand and he made it very, very easy to understand. The Lyceum manual is full of things like that. And most of the hymns in the SNU hymn book are in the Lyceum manual. That's where the SNU got them from, because they're so good. Catch the Sunshine and others like them are in there either as hymns or songs or as musical readings. And the musical readings were used for the calisthenics when the kids marched up and down, so they're all at marching pace. So again, it was quite innovative for the time that it was published, because it was intended that children would read it, not children would learn it parrot fashion. They had to read it. To raise funds to have it published was very difficult. But Harry Kersey said, "I'll give the money." So Harry Kersey paid for it to be published. And it was published, printed, and put out on sale. I think the first ones went out at 5 shillings, which is what, 25p. The music for the hymns and the songs and the musical readings was another problem. Harry Kersey's sister was a musician. She was a pianist. And she said, "Leave them with me." And she produced another work, The Spiritualist Songster, which again is still on sale. You can still buy it. From Stansted, they have several copies left, and they are the original copies, because we never had it reprinted. It's never been reprinted. It's as it was. It contains all the music for all the hymns that are in the Lyceum manual. So those two companion books, if you like, went out, and the Lyceums loved them. The Lyceums had something at last to look at and say, "This is ours." So churches that are beginning to form, churches have something to do a reading from. And the reading not only was there, but the explanation was there as well. So that if the president or whoever was reading it didn't really understand it, all he had to do was read on. It was an absolute miracle of a book. It much before its time, and it was very, very well received by all. And even to today, it's one of the books that, traveling around as the medium, I used to smile to myself because I think every church rostrum in the country has a copy of the Lyceum manual on it. It is a marvelous publication. I can't recommend it enough.
I think the Lyceum manual is just a symbol of the tremendous work and effort and creativity and coordination of all those people at that time to make it happen, and clearly very innovative for the time and instructional, but encouraging people to think for themselves too. So it had an amazing impact. Do you think there was a significant impact made by the Lyceum, bearing in mind the times are very different from now, and for many quite a struggle?
Yeah, there was a massive impact both in America and in England. The Lyceum was a huge thing. Its impact upon the life of the population was tremendous. We hear about the people, the pioneers of spiritualism, who could fill the Albert Hall and talk for 3 hours, never give a message. You know, their foundation was in the Lyceum. They if you like, they learnt their craft in the Lyceum, because the Lyceumists are taught to speak up and stand up and join in, not sit back like little roses sat against the wall. You know? One story that comes to mind that I find fascinating, I find it incredible. In America, they had a magazine which went out monthly. And this magazine went however it could. And on one occasion, a letter was published in the magazine from a gentleman and his wife. And they were thrilled to bits at an article that had been put in the magazine. So they written back and said how wonderful it was, this article, and they were looking forward to the next copy, which had the remainder of the story on it. And when the editor got it, it was 9 months after the article had been published. It had taken 7 months for the article to reach them by stagecoach, pony express rider. It had gone across America, across the Great Plains. It had been subject to being attacked by Indians, and the Lord knows what, but it arrived eventually in this settlement, this hamlet in the middle of nowhere. And these people had sent a reply back as soon as they could. And the editor couldn't believe that it would have such an impact on the lives of someone. And it had taken so much effort to get that information to the people. That's the impact that the Lyceum has. The Banner, which is the British version of the magazine, which is published monthly, still published. It was first published in 1901. And apart from, I think, 3 months during the Second World War, when they couldn't get any paper, it's been in continuous publication. J.J. Morse took over publication about 1912 for a couple of years. And then Alfred Kitson took it on and until the latter part of his life was the editor. And the Banner partakes in the essence of sending out information. It's not as much information these days. There tends to be a lot of articles about different things, but we try to encourage people to do in the Lyceum, but it still has an impact. And we know that because I remember going to Belper Church in Derbyshire. And it was the anniversary of the church. And the Lyceum had taken an idea that had been put out by the banner. And it wasn't anything to do with me. I edit the banner now. Nothing to do with me. It was somebody before me. They put an article out about how the children could perhaps put something together and present it to the church. Well, these children had. And Mary, my wife, and I sat on the rostrum in Belper Church with a great big pipe organ behind us, being played by a Lyceumist. The conductor of the Lyceum was the chairman for the meeting. And there were about 8 or 10 children, ranging from 4 upwards, all standing at the side of the rostrum. And one at a time, these children came up and stood at the front of the rostrum. In their time, they'd all drawn a picture of the flower, and they all explained what the flower was about, why it was useful, why we should look after it. And one little girl in particular, I've never ever forgotten, came along and she had an orange box with her. Not one of the flimsy ones, quite a firm orange box, like Speaker's Corner type orange box. And she very carefully placed this box and stood on it so she could see over the top of the rostrum. She delivered her speech word perfectly in a loud, clear voice. And that is the embodiment of what the Lyceum is about. That little girl was 4. She could stand up and speak in public. She could make herself understood. She could explain what she'd done, and she did it so well. That's what the Lyceum is for. It's to educate people, not just tiny children, but adults as well. When they come into church, they don't know anything. And does anybody bother to tell them when we're sitting in the church? Oh yes, if you sit there and be quiet, you'll get a message and you go home, you know. No, the Lyceum likes to think that we can educate these people, tell them what spiritualism is about. And that way, hopefully, we get better congregations, we get better church committees, and we get better mediums, all from this one idea that you can educate people. We don't have them marching up and down, mind. We've done away with calisthenics, but you might find Tai Chi in some of the Lyceums, and you might find musical movement or dancing. There are all sorts of things being done, but we don't really do calisthenics anymore. There used to be one church in Manchester that had a calisthenics group, but I don't think they're there anymore.
So we can see there
it's a very, very interesting understanding of what spiritualism start was, and it's a good start.
Absolutely, and it's just great to see the legacy and just to know that the work of our pioneers from all that time ago is still echoing through the decades to today. So before we go, Brian, could you tell us what the Lyceum means to you? What impact it's made on your life?
It's the impact it's made on my life is very, very profound. It's profound in the sense that I look at other people and see what they find within the Lyceum. There's always something else to find. It's a way that people approach education. It's a way that they can learn. There's a gentleman in Scotland that recently joined the Lyceum, and he's doing one of the Lyceum courses, but he's been sending articles into the banner, and if he's listening to this, he'll know who he is. But he's written some very good articles to the banner, and I've enjoyed publishing them because they actually show me that gentleman is starting to think. He's starting to think about spiritualism. He's not just accepting it for what it is, he's thinking about it. So to me, that's what the Lyceum is about. It's about taking something that starts off with nothing and building on it until you've got something worth having, and something that will lead into a brighter future. That is yet a brighter day, says in Catch the Sunshine. Or as Captain Tom would say, tomorrow will be a good day. And that's what the Lyceum's legacy should be. Tomorrow will be a good day. For me, I am, if you like, in awe of the way that these pioneers came together and put together a functioning organisation that has stood the test of time. It wasn't that they were all poor people or all rich people. There were scientists and all sorts of different people from different walks of life that came together and formed a new beginning from what they had. Most of them were either Methodists or Church of England. Most of them, if not all of them. Very few of them actually came into spiritualism from birth. People like David Richmond, who walked from the northeast Sunderland to Keighley in West Yorkshire, to find somewhere that there was a group that he could understand. And that group at Keighley that were meeting in the old club premises was the foundation of Keighley Spiritualist Church that David Richmond kick-started them into doing. That's what the Lyceum does. If it doesn't have a centre of its own, it kick-starts someone into having one. Recently, there has been a decline. I say recently, and I'm looking at the last 30 years probably. Before that, there were well over 1,500 Lyceums in England. Well over. The Lyceum had a set of homes that people could go to if they were without money. They could apply to the Ainsworth Homes of Rest. They could go for a fortnight on holiday to the seaside. They're no longer within the Lyceum movement. Haven't been for a long time, but the Lyceum had them and did things with them for people, not just Lyceumists, for people. And that's, again, one of the things that I see greatly with the Lyceum, that it works for people. It doesn't single out any group of people. We're not here for spiritualists. We're here for everybody. We're just a group of people who want to join together and form an educational bond so that we can bolster up your church. We want you, the bodies, we want you to be part and parcel of an educational system that will make spiritualism great. This time, Hydesville Day, which celebrates a wonderful event in spiritualism, this period in time is an awakening. The Lyceum wants to join in that awakening because we were part of it. We want to awaken people's ideas. And I look back, I'm from Batley, that's my hometown. And Alfred Kitson's from Ossett, just up the road. He lived most of his life in Batley. In fact, he lived in Taylor Street in Batley, where I was brought up. So I know what Taylor Street was like. I lived in a back-to-back terraced house with a bedroom and a downstairs, and that was it. The cellar, a downstairs room, and a bedroom. That was it. Toilet was across the yard. It was an outside toilet, as most of them were then. It was very, very poor housing. Not exactly slums, but very poor housing. Thrown up quickly. It's now down. It's flattened. And modern housing up there. But Alfred lived just up the road. I didn't know it. He died before I was born. But I knew his family. They're from that same stock. That same, a quotation comes to mind, the dark satanic mills. That's what Batley was. It was heavy Woolen district, Woolen town. On the outskirts of it were the coal mines, and people either worked down the mines or in the mills. Wherever you went, it was hard work. So Alfred's from the same place as me, or I'm from the same place as him. And I think because of that, I identify with him. The other book, which we published, is Alfred Kitson's autobiography, and I would thoroughly recommend that to anyone who wants a good read. He tells his story. He tells his story quite well. I read it with fascination because he talks about all the places where, as a boy, I went to play. He talks about going on picnics to Howley. There used to be a hall at Howley, And as kids, we used to say, "Oh, Cromwell came and bombarded it." He didn't at all. Nothing to do with Cromwell. It was a manor house, and it fell into disrepair and it fell down. But of course, kids being kids, it was Cromwell and done it, and there were dungeons underneath it. So, Alfred talks about the cellars at Townley Hall and the haunting at Townley Hall, but they had lovely picnics there. I remember going up there. I remember a lot of the walks he went on, so I can identify what he was talking about in a lot of the ways that he explained things. I'm not special. I'm not more special than any other Lyceumist, but I identify with where Alfred came from, and in effect where he went to, and how he arrived there. Batley Lyceum was founded by Alfred. Dewsbury Lyceum was founded by Alfred. He lived at Hanging Heaton, where my relatives lived. It's all part and parcel of the same area. It's hilly, it's grimy, it's industrial, it's dirty, and it's very, very hard work. Not so much now, but it was. Alfred came from good stock. He came from good stock, and he produced a wonderful tree for Lyceum to grow on.
Brian, thank you so much for just taking us through that amazing history of the Lyceum and giving us an insight into Alfred Kitson, his contribution to spiritualism and to the Lyceum movement, and what it's meant for you personally as well. And I think for those of you out there who are interested in the Lyceum, I hope this has sparked an interest in you. We'll put details on the screen where you can find out more. But again, thank you, Brian. For those of us who love the history of spiritualism and the Lyceum, it's been great to talk to you. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you very much.